What's up, Tristan Talks family? Welcome back, guys, to my YouTube. This is Tristan Talks. We're never doing that again. Um, I hope you all are well. Uh, hope you all are well. I've been really busy this week with school. Got like two projects. I haven't been to my 12 o'clock in years. Oh my gosh. But I'm still passing, of course. You don't have to worry about that. My grades are phenomenal. But excuse me. Excuse me. I'm lucky I don't have a microphone on because if y'all heard that, that would be disgusting. Maybe they did hear it. But we're gonna talk about something was really interested in. I'm still very interested in, um, the history of slavery, and like not like the whitewash version or what they teach you in high school and middle school. Actual history of slavery. Starting from before there was black and white, before the racial slavery, all of that. We're gonna get into it. Um, I when I first came to my college, I did a whole study for about 4 months on just rewriting what they told me about slavery, and I found out something new every single day. It was genuinely insane how much like stuff they hid from us about slavery, where I had to deep dive, to find something different. I have papers here, but I'm not gonna dig through them of just documents of slaves and like pictures and all this. It's good stuff. But every day I was talking about or reading something about new slavery, and I'm excited to share it. But when we think about slavery, we think about like the cotton fields, the Civil War, the Underground Railroad, and Nat Turner. And all of that is real and all of that matters, of course. But today we're going to go deeper into the parts of history that really didn't make into the American textbooks. The uncomfortable parts, the complicated parts, just the parts that challenge you, and what you thought you knew about who owned slaves, who fought back, who how the whole system actually came to be. Because slavery in America is far more complex and far more layered and far more disturbing than the simplified version most of us grew up hearing. But we're going to talk about before black and white, how the racial slavery was invented. So when the first Americans arrived in Virginia in 1619, most of them came not as slaves for life, but as indentured servants. So the same status was roughly half of two-thirds of white European who came to the colonies held. Um, Black and white indentured servants worked side by side in the tobacco fields. They lived together and they ran together and they rebelled together, right? This system was simple that you work for a set number of years, usually 4 to 7 years, and then you go free, sometimes even receiving land, supplies, and tools. In fact, several of these original African arrivals in Virginia completed their indenture and went on to own land themselves. So, how did we get from centuries of permanent race based chattel slavery? The answer is the Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Nathaniel Bacon organized a coalition of poor white and black indentured servants and freedmen who were furious at the colonial elite, right? They marched together, burned Jamestown to the ground, and terrified the plantation owning class. The problem wasn't just the rebellion, it was the alliance. Black and white laborers unified against the wealthy few. So, what did the colonial elite do? They drove a wedge between them deliberately. And after Bacon's rebellion, Virginia and the other colonies began passing laws that gave poor white servants small privileges, like the right to carry weapons, exemption from certain punishments, while systematically stripping every right from black workers, right? By the early 1700s, Virginia law codified that enslaved status would be inherit through their mother, making it permanent and hereditary, right? Blackness became a mark of enslavement. Whiteness became a mark of freedom, even if you were still poor and barely free. Racial slavery was ancient. It wasn't inevitable. It was invented, right? deliberately constructed to prevent black and white workers from ever uniting again. And we still see this today, right? We still see a racial system online and saying that whites are better than blacks are better than whites. At the end of the day, we all poor. At the end of the day, we not in the 1%. So why not workers of the world unite? You know, no matter if you're black and white, and this is what many like socialist view get wrong now. They focus strictly on class when critiquing historiography. They focus strictly on class, but once the revolution comes and you defeat the class structure, racism will still exist. So as a revolutionary, as a socialist, as a communist, you must focus on class, race, and gender. These three things, you can't do anything without these three things being addressed. You know, we can focus on class, but you also have to focus on race and gender. If you only focus on race, you have to focus on class and gender. If you only focus on gender, you have to focus on race and class. Right? But we're also going to talk about the Native Americans, and they had a hidden role in this, and they had civilized tribes in slavery, right? Most Americans grew up with a simple mental picture of that Native Americans were victims of colonization, like enslaved black people were the other victims. And both of these things are true, yes, but what's almost never taught is that there's a significant number of Native Americans who owned enslaved black people, and did so with the same brutality as the white Southern planters. Now, I'm not trying to call out Native Americans. I'm telling the real history. But the five nations known as the five civilized tribes, was a Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, adopted chattel slavery of African Americans as part of their strategy to survive white pressure. The United States government under George Washington sent agents to live among native peoples and explicitly it told them, if you want to keep your land, you need to prove your civilization. This is not a Native American fault. This is systematically what the white man and what the man in power has put into play to make it seem that the Native Americans are against us. Just how they did with black and whites in after Bacon's Rebellion. Excuse me. In the eyes of white Americans at the time, owning enslaved people was considered a marker of civilization. So these nations obviously did it. They passed their own black codes, they enacted slave patrols, they prohibited enslaved people from learning to read, and they crushed slave rebellions on their own plantations. By 1860s, the Cherokee Nation held over 25,000 enslaved black people, and over 15% of their population were enslaved black people, and the Choctaw held over 23,000. And then comes the Trail of Tears, a genuine atrocity committed against Native people. But what is almost never discussed is that when these tribes were forcibly marched west to Indian Territory, their enslaved black people marched with them. The enslaved Africans endured the same brutal conditions, disease, starvation, exposure, and had no choice in the matter of all. When the Civil War came, most of the five tribes sided with the Confederacy because they had a direct economic stake in maintaining slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't even apply to them. Slavery in Indian Territory didn't officially end until the treaties of 1866, a full year after the war ended. And the story obviously doesn't stop there. After emancipation, the U.S. government required the five tribes to grant full citizenship to their freed people. Most eventually did, but in the 20th century, several tribes systematically removing the descendants of their former enslaved people from tribal roles, stripping them of citizenship rights, land claims, and tribal benefits. Legal battles are still being fought over this today. Oh, sorry. I'm just making sure my notes is right. I'm not going to edit that out, by the way. But we're going to also talk about black slave owners. I'm going to handle this with care in the context it deserves. Let's use our brains. Some free black people in antebellum South owned enslaved people. Yes. And before anyone uses that fact to muddy the waters around the broader history of slavery, we need to understand why and who. By 1830, there were approximately 3,775 black slaveholders in the South who held around 12,760 enslaved people, and a southern slave population of 2.3 million. That is a fraction of a fraction, right? But it's real and it deserves honest examination. The overwhelming evidence from historians is that the mass majority of black people who legally owned enslaved people did so to protect them. Specifically, family members in many southern states, manumission laws made it almost impossible for a free black person to simply set a relative free. Some states require costly legal fees, and others require legislative approval. And a few states banned manumission entirely. So a free black person who bought their spouse or their child from a white owner could not always legally free them. And if they tried, the state would confiscate that person and sell them to someone else. So holding a family member as legal property was for many free black people the only way to keep them safe. But this is critical, right? Not all cases were about family protection. They were free black individuals, particularly in Louisiana and South Carolina, who owned enslaved people for economic gain. William Ellison, a formerly enslaved man who became a prosperous cotton gin maker in South Carolina, eventually held up to 171 enslaved people and operated a large plantation. He was not purchasing family. He was operating within the same brutal system that once enslaved him. And he participated in it fully. And Henry Louis Gates Jr. noted in some states, the percentage of free blackheads of household who owned slaves was strikingly high, 43% in South Carolina and 40% in Louisiana. Both those numbers include both protective purchasers and economic participants. And they can't be read without understanding the suffocating legal environment that shaped every decision a free black person made in the antebellum South. So the existence of black slave owners is not evidence that slavery was acceptable or chosen or mutual. It is evidence how thoroughly and completely the system of slavery distorted every human relationship it touched, including among the people it was designed to destroy. I mean, skinfolk ain't kinfolk. But you have to understand, during the antebellum South, you were either going to participate in the same system that you were in, or what money were you going to make? And I'm not saying slavery was acceptable. I'm saying this is real stuff that people had to decide. I'm going to tell you the real stuff, right? Where they also buried a lot of rebellions. I mean, everyone knows about Nat Turner. Fewer people know what happened the year before Nat Turner was even born. They called it the German Coast Uprising of 1811. It's the largest slave revolt in United States history, and most Americans have never heard of it. In January 1811, a man named Charles Lawrence, a mixed race enslaved man who worked as a slave driver on a Louisiana sugar plantation, organized an uprising that drew somewhere from 200 and 500 enslaved people. They armed themselves with farming tools, cane knives, and weapons seized from plantations. And they marched toward New Orleans behind banners shouting for liberty. They burned plantations as they went. They were organized, they had military formation, they were inspired in part by the Haitian Revolution, the only successful large-scale slave rebellion in the Western Hemisphere, which had included just 7 years earlier. The rebellion was crushed by a combination of federal troops and local militia, but DeLons was captured and executed in the most brutal fashion imaginable. The heads of the rebel leaders were mounted on pikes along the Mississippi River as a warning. So this uprising was systematically buried in historical record before acknowledging it was dangerous. Slaveholders knew that if the story spread, that it would inspire others, and it wasn't the only one. So the Gabriel's Rebellion of 1800 was organized by an enslaved blacksmith named Gabriel Prosser, who planned to seize Richmond, Virginia, to take the governor hostage and demand freedom. Thousands were reportedly ready to march under a banner that read "Death or Liberty." A deliberate inversion of Patrick Henry's famous cry, a torrential storm and two informants stopped them, and Gabriel and 25 others were hanged. Denmark Vesey in 1822. A formerly enslaved man who had purchased his freedom spent years organizing what may have been the most ambitious conspiracy in American history. Estimates suggest that as many as 99,000 people were involved in a plan to take Charleston, South Carolina. His network was portrayed by informants before a single blow was struck. Vesey and 47 others were executed. Scholars have identified over 250 documented uprisings involving Taylor Moore enslaved people throughout American history, and some researchers have found evidence of more than 350. Most were small, and most were suppressed immediately, and most were erased from the public by the very people who feared them most. Enslaved people were not passive. They were not waiting to be rescued. They fought constantly in ways large and small with the full understanding that failure meant death, right? And chapter 5 is the slave Bible and the weaponization of religion. This rarely gets mentioned in the classroom, and it rarely gets mentioned today, which this is a whole nother video that I have some thoughts about, but I would probably make that video, but this is a whole nother video. Slaveholders knew the Bible was dangerous. I'm just going to get into a little bit of it, though. You know me. Slaveholders knew that the Bible was dangerous. The Exodus story alone, enslaved people rising up and escaping their oppressors, was exactly the kind of narrative they could not allow, right? So they did something extraordinary. Not extraordinary. I'm not going to call it extraordinary. They did something. No, they just made their own Bible. They called it the Slave Bible, officially titled parts of the Holy Bible selected for the use of Negro slaves. It removed about 90% of the Old Testament and roughly half of the New Testament. Exodus was gone. The chapter Exodus was gone. The story of liberation. Gone were passages about justice for the oppressed. What remained were passages that could have been used to enforce a mission, like servants obey your masters. It was not religion being offered to slave people. It was religion being weaponized against them. A system of control dressed in scripture. So, the history of slavery is not a simple story with simple heroes and villains. It is a story about what systems of powers do to every person they touch. It is a story about how race itself, as a legal and social category, was deliberately manufactured to keep poor people divided, right? It is a story about resistance that was documented and then erased. When we flatten this history into a version that fits on a timeline, we lose the full weight of it, and we lose the ability to truly understand what it built and what it broke. The people who were enslaved in this country were not footnotes. They were engineers, musicians, rebels, strategists, parents, philosophers, living inside a system designed to make the world forget they exist. But this is Tristan Talks. And we don't forget around here. We don't forget around here. But I appreciate y'all for listening. Drop a comment if anything you thought I said was interesting, or if you have a question, or if you want to know anything, or if you want to tell me something I missed. I would love to know, and I would answer them all, unless you're trying to rage bait me. I would not answer it. Peace.